Welcome, Litigation Nation. I'm your host, Jack Sanker, along with my co-host, Danessa Watkins. Today, we're joined by a very special guest, Ms. Petra Molnar, who's a lawyer, an anthropologist specializing in migration and human rights. Petra has been working in this space since the mid-2000s as a community organizer. Her work, as we'll get into it, has taken her to conflict areas and militarized spaces in Jordan, Turkey, Greece, the Philippines, Palestine and Israel, Kenya, Colombia, and on the U.S.-Mexico border and all over Europe. She's currently the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab at York University and Faculty Associate at the Merkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. You could find her published in the New York Times, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, the Transnational Institute, and all over the internet. She joins us today to talk about policy and law of border security, migration, immigration, surveillance, which she wrote about brilliantly in her new book, The Walls Have Eyes: Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Petra, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today.
I have a whole section here that's kind of like your bio, bullet points of who you are and everything else, but I think it would probably be best if you just summarized who you are, what your background is, and why it is that you're writing on this topic.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So like you said, I'm a lawyer and an anthropologist by training, but I'm not a technologist. And about 6 years ago, I fell into this area of trying to understand how new technologies are impacting the way that people are moving and crossing borders. And it's taken me on a bit of a wild ride all around the world and culminated in the publication of my first book called The Walls Have Eyes: Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, which tries to tell this global story of how AI and surveillance and drones and all sorts of other experimental projects are playing out across the world's borders.
Did you get into the technology aspect of it just because of your personal experiences and seeing, what was out there and what was being used and maybe things that we mainstream don't hear about?
Yeah, kind of. So I am a practicing lawyer, although I don't take too many cases anymore. But back then I was, doing more, I guess you could call it kind of traditional issues, things like gender-based violence, other types of issues like immigration detention, but not technology. And it was really as a result of an event that we held at work, kind of on technology and power, trying to understand how new projects that are kind of being introduced are exacerbating racism, discrimination, and just terrible experiences that people are having. And then I started asking questions like, what is happening on the immigration side? But again, I'm not a tech person by training. And back then, my knowledge of these things was really limited. We're talking like Wikipedia level knowledge of what's an algorithm. And I found it quite intimidating because sometimes I think the technology space can be a bit difficult to penetrate. But I saw time and again that these new kind of projects and technologies were being introduced without really having a conversation about their human rights impacts, what it's doing to real people. And from a legal perspective, that was really troubling for me. And so, yeah, it was a bit of a happy accident, I suppose. But it's taken me, on this journey of trying to understand this interplay.
And Danessa was asking about, your like quote unquote personal experiences. And I think it's like well worth highlighting here that maybe unlike some academic work here, this book and what you had to do to get this book together involved quite a lot of like literal boots on the ground, going to hotly contested, sometimes militarized spaces, making, I don't know what you want to call yourself in this scenario, but I would say investigative reporting to some extent, and actually kind of getting your hands dirty, quite literally. And so if you wouldn't mind just kind of giving the audience a taste for where you were physically, and what you kind of the spaces you were in as you were putting together what eventually turned out to become this book.
This is, I think, where the kind of anthropology hat comes in, this commitment of trying to work from a grounded perspective. So being present in spaces where these technologies are playing out. And again, it kind of happened organically, but as I was expanding my own understanding of how new technologies are being used at the border, I went from Canada to different parts of Europe, I ended up living in Greece for almost 3 years because it was one of the kind of key sites of technological experimentation at the border. But then also because I've always worked from a kind of a comparative perspective. I find comparison to be a very, very useful tool of analysis. And so being able to say, okay, well, this is happening along the fringes of Europe, but what is happening at the US-Mexico border? What's happening in East Africa? What's happening in occupied Palestinian territories? All of these spaces speak to one another. But you're right. I mean, it is kind of ultimately coming from a commitment of being present in these spaces because there's only so much you can do from the ivory tower or an office somewhere.
Right.
And I think it's perhaps also motivated by the fact that I, have my own migration story that has motivated, I think, perhaps my work in this area more generally, but also the commitment to try and tell complex stories from a human perspective. Because I really didn't want to write an academic book that would be sitting on a shelf somewhere that was just impenetrable and really heavily written. This is meant more as a story to be able to illustrate some of the impacts of this technology on real people.
Yeah, and that's what I flew through your book. So I think that's great about The Walls Have Eyes is you kind of start out with this personal story of something you experienced, people you met along the way, their struggles, sharing their perspective, and then describe the technologies that are being used really I don't know, unfairly, illegally, I would say, even though maybe the laws aren't in place yet, but it puts a real humanization to what, like you said, could otherwise just be kind of a stale talk about the technologies. But once you start meeting these players and the people that you came into contact with and how it affects their lives, it's a page turner. I will say that. But also it made me feel like, wow, my head's been buried under the sand to not realize, how these things are being used. So can't say enough good things about the book. I've already shared it with all of my family. So my mother-in-law is in Arizona and she had no idea about the robot dogs that are being deployed there. Can you discuss a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's probably one of the more visceral examples in the book. So when I first went to Arizona, as again one of these spaces where technological experimentation intersects with the border, I also had no idea that it was going to be kind of one of these flashpoints for, again, these really high risk technologies that are essentially something that you might see on, a sci-fi episode of like the Black Mirror or some other show,
Yes,
that
literally
listeners, yeah, literally, right. And so when in Arizona, I started working with some search and rescue groups that are there to assist people who are crossing the desert. Because the Sonora Desert is such a beautiful place, but it's also a very deadly place. And people lose their lives as they're making the journeys to try and claim asylum. And then you have these search and rescue groups that are often also sometimes made up of, 70 and 80-year-olds who, instead of relaxing on a sun lounger, are going to drop water in the desert or show up for people in these really kind ways. And I spent some time with one particular group called the Battalion Search and Rescue. And we went and trekked into the Sonora Desert to visit a memorial site of Mr. Alvarado, who was a young husband and father who essentially died mere kilometers away from a major highway as a result of these kind of draconian surveillance technologies that are pushing people more and more into the desert. But right around that time, in probably one of the most surreal moments of my career, and now that you've read the book, I think you've probably seen I've had many of such moments. It was right around that time that we were literally on the sands of the Sonora that the Department of Homeland Security announced that they would be augmenting their kind of migration management arsenal with robodogs, which are essentially a quadruped military-grade technology that is autonomous and that would be joining this arsenal of border enforcement tech and chasing people like Mr. Alvarado through the desert. I mean, this is some of the sharpest kind of manifestations of the technologies that I explore in the book, but by no means the only tech that's also used at the border. Especially the US-Mexico territory is one where so much technological experimentation occurs, whether it's like AI towers that are dotted throughout the Sonora, different surveillance equipment, license plate readers. It creates this surveillance dragnet that people are increasingly caught in.
The term that we're using here, which I find so interesting, but it's worth connecting the dots on, technological experimentation. Um, it's implied, and I mean, it's also true, but it's implied that the different policies, technologies, or just ways of doing things are being tried out on the borders, not just the United States Mexico border, but you get into a lot of detail places all over the world. But the term, experiment is implying that they're going to take certain elements of those things that either work or don't work, and then will broadly end up being applied towards domestic populations, right? This is I think it's Foucault's boomerang. I don't know if you know. Yeah, it's exactly that, which is a policing tactics or technologies that will work against a population abroad will inevitably find its way back to the domestic population. And you give several examples in the book. The drones that are being deployed on the southern border of the United States, when they're not being used by like the Department of Homeland Security or whatever other agencies are using them, they're being lent to local law enforcement, for example. Many things like that. So I think it's so interesting because if you're coming from this, or looking at this kind of border security thing, which is like obviously a very political issue, from whatever perspective you want to come at it from, I think it's extremely politically charged, but it's so interesting because you ought to care. You should care what's happening down there from whatever perspective you're approaching it from. And anyone who has this sort of, maybe viewpoint that's common on the right of like big government surveillance or tracking and all those things, you don't have to be conspiratorial. It's like literally happening. And this is the proving ground for it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, even the robodogs that we were just talking about, right? A year after they were announced at the US-Mexico border, the New York City Police Department held a press conference and proudly announced that they wanted to use robodogs on the streets of New York to quote, keep New York safe. And one was even painted white with black spots on it, like a Dalmatian. I mean, again, it's this kind of normalization of tech that starts at the border and then bleeds over into other facets of public life. So I think it's kind of a twofold thing here, right? Like, I think it's really important to pay attention to what happens at the border because they are spaces that are, very opaque, very discretionary, difficult to understand why certain decisions get made. Creates this kind of perfect proving ground or testing ground for experimentation that maybe at first blush wouldn't be allowed in other spaces. But then what happens is over time, it becomes normalized and then starts proliferating into other facets, whether that is, again, the robodogs on New York streets or the surveillance of protesters, or even sports fans. There are now conversations about using facial recognition in sports stadiums, for example, right? So again, it is this normalization of tech that we really need to pay attention to.
Well, I was going to say, a couple shows ago on our podcast, we were talking about biometric data and recent laws that were passed regarding that, or that are being used more frequently in the US to try to protect people from the collection of that type of data or the use of it or how it's stored. So I did think it was interesting, I guess, and not surprising that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, so UNHCR, that they're collecting that biometric data in Kenya. And then it brings this question of, well, okay, so they have this huge database. Now, who has access to it? I saw that it's being shared with the US, even if those refugees aren't making it here. You mentioned that it's vulnerable to hacking. I mean, data is king now. So yeah, once we have all of this information, very sensitive information about people, who has access to it, how is it protected, why is it being shared, for what purposes? Because the people whose data is being collected, they don't have any say in that. So yeah, what aside from, or if you want to talk about Kenya, but I'm sure that there are other places where this is happening, and what are the effects of that?
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Nessa, because that's kind of the underlying logic sometimes, the fact that data is the new oil, right? And we need more and more data to power these technologies of surveillance and automation and just, this kind of incursion of tech in our daily life. Like, it cannot be done without data. But then it also is important to ask who is the data subject and who can opt out from being part of these massive databases. Because ultimately, the conversation I think that we're having is about technology, but it's actually about power. And it's also about the opportunity to say, no, I don't want to be part of this. And when we're talking about spaces like refugee camps, that is where there's a huge power differential. And that's even inherent in the way that international organizations like the United Nations is operating in a pretty problematic way, because they've also normalized biometric data and iris scanning, for example, in refugee camps in Jordan. Instead of people using an identity card, they now have their eyes scanned and then they get their weekly food rations. Like at first blush, that sounds good, because of course you want to be able to disperse humanitarian support quickly and efficiently. But how do people actually feel about that, right? Well, I mean, how would we feel if we went into, I don't know, a grocery store and all of a sudden it was like, well, we have to scan your irises before you can come in? The people would be up in arms. But when that actually happens in a refugee camp, those discussions are not being had. And, I've spoken with people who say, well, I feel really uncomfortable about this, but if I don't get my irises scanned, I don't eat that week. That's not really free and informed consent, right? It really breaks down along these lines of just huge power differentials. And also it reduces people to data points rather than actually seeing their full humanity. And one last thing I will say is, and you already alluded to it, is the vast kind of human rights impact of what happens when there are data breaches or when really sensitive information is inappropriately stored or shared. And this has already happened. The UN collected a bunch of information on Rohingya refugees who were escaping Myanmar, ended up in Bangladesh, have been living there for many years now. They collected all this information and then inadvertently shared it with Myanmar, the government that the refugees were fleeing from. I mean, that's a huge breach, right? Huge. Yeah. And yet, how can this happen? We really need a lot more conversations about just why is even this data being collected in the first place, and why is it being shared and stored in these inappropriate ways?
I find so many of the kind of like, I don't want to, take a strong political position on this, but there's so many of like the talking points from either side you want to come at here. And the kind of conspiratorial, maybe, tinfoil hat stuff that people often will talk about and you kind of brush off but no one's actually like pointing the finger at the right thing when they kind of say this. And so the 2017 extreme vetting initiative that you discuss in the book from which ICE I believe is still using, or I don't know if it's been halted or not, but which involves assessment of someone's personal social media, like risk profiles, that's based on, as I understand it, a completely opaque algorithm for which we have no idea or very little idea what the inputs are. A lot of that information is classified, as something you mentioned in the book. Travel records, of course, and the goal of this, giant Rube Goldberg machine of social assessment of someone is, to determine whether that person would, quote, be a positively contributing member of society, and to predict whether they intend to commit criminal terrorist acts after entering the community or entering the country, unquote. And that is, to me, I mean, that is so, Minority Report. That is, for people that bang their fists on the table about like, the Chinese social credit score or whatever, that's kind of exactly what this is here. So it's so interesting because folks that may otherwise not be inclined to be sympathetic towards the things that are happening to migrants at the border who, haven't asked for it and don't deserve it, ought to care, right? Because of the way that, these are the big government surveillance and things that, they say that they're worried about. It's already happening. It's just happening to a population that no one cares about.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And it doesn't just stay there, right? Like just because things are tested out at the border, then they become normalized, and then, it opens up the ambit much, much more broadly. And I think the examples that you're bringing up, Jack, are really quite disturbing, right? Because they are forward looking. It is really like a Minority Report situation where Like, really, are we comfortable with governments making predictions about our behavior in the future? And based on what, right? Oftentimes, we don't even know what the parameters are. I mean, the extreme vetting initiative is perhaps the most extreme example of this, but other jurisdictions have done the same. New Zealand, for example, introduced kind of a pilot project where they wanted to root out quote unquote likely troublemakers. What does that even mean, right? What grounds will that break down upon, right? I mean, we can all imagine how incredibly racist and discriminatory this can be, right? And I think, again, as we are seeing a shift to the right all across the world and having these really heightened conversations about migration, about security, about the environment, right? And the fact that many people are going to be migrating as a result of environmental degradation. If we normalize these kind of predictive technologies, chances are that we're going to be seeing more and more of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was wondering too, I mean, we saw in the US, particularly like after 9/11, I think more Americans were open to the idea of higher security and more surveillance because we felt, we had been attacked. Okay, now we're okay maybe with the government monitoring more. Did we see something like that with COVID-19 as well, where suddenly everyone kind of feels vulnerable? And so maybe people are more open to, and I don't mean obviously people at the border, but I mean, in domestic areas, are people more open to these technologies that are intrusive simply because they feel more vulnerable?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been others who've been doing really amazing work kind of tracking this vulnerability and how it's also kind of weaponized against people in crisis, right? Because of course, I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic was and is a global health crisis, right? And so it makes sense that people who are, all of us, experiencing this kind of unprecedented event, that maybe, psychologically there's a predisposition to grasp at straws and say, well, whatever we can get to make the world better, we are going to do that. But there was a lot of laws, not even just surveillance, but like a lot of, stretching of what normally people would not be comfortable with. But again, because we were in a massive crisis, it normalized the ability of the state to say, well, we're going to incur or create incursions on people's, freedom of movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
People's freedom of expression, data gathering indiscriminately and all of that. And a lot of that, those vestiges have remained with us, right? And I think that's the concern. Whenever we are operating from a crisis mentality, unfortunately, scholars have for decades, centuries, been kind of trying to raise alarms about this, that crisis actually breeds the normalization of more and more control, right? And unfortunately, we are seeing a time that is informed by crisis thinking, right? Whether it's the environment or political crises or just the widening, kind of divisions between groups. I think the concern is that, again, technology is a lens through which to understand power and who is around the table when we innovate on and why, and who gets to decide, like, yes, we need more surveillance, or we need more robodogs, or we need more data, versus actually thinking about, well, how can we use technology to improve the lives of people? There's kind of that other side to it too, but again, it always breaks down along the lines of power and privilege, especially in times of crisis.
Speaking of COVID-19, you write about in your book the some of the lockdowns that were in place in European countries. I mean, I think also applicable here, but in Greece, for example, the kind of lockdown procedures and protocols that were in place were the government there took advantage of those to keep migrants, for example, in camps for much longer than they would have been under normal circumstances. And again, that to me is it just echoes so loudly of the like conspiratorial, if you remember in the United States, like they're going to use COVID to put us all in camps, kind of crazy talk that you ignore. And then here we are, here's like a quote unquote Western country, which kind of did that. and it's, it kind of happened there. It's the, Orwellian stuff that, a certain political class pundits in this country, make their money talking about all the time. But because it happens to a group of people that, no one seems to worry about too much, it's completely, like I learned this reading your book. And you would think that folks that were concerned about that type of thing would have learned this when it happened 2 or 3 years ago. And it flies completely under the radar just due to really the identity of those who are affected by it the most. And it's absolutely fascinating when you kind of think about it through that lens, at least for me.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of kind of flying under the radar, pun intended, since we're talking about radars.
Right. Yeah.
That happens at the border, right? Because again, they are spaces of opacity and also a space of crisis, right? And we are seeing this around the world where borders are increasingly becoming militarized. And also difficult to access for human rights monitors like me, but also for journalists, right? It again kind of plays into this mentality that the border is this kind of free for all where anything can happen, this kind of frontier zone of experimentation, which has happened for many, many years. It's just now we have this tech that also plays into it. And that's perhaps where, I remember, Danessa, you said something early on in our conversation that, there's not a lot of law right now. And that's precisely it. Because we don't have a lot of guardrails around just technological experimentation, period, let alone at the border, it exacerbates a lot of the kind of high risk projects that are playing out there, largely unknown. Oftentimes, people find out about them as a result of some like random investigation or through sheer chance, or a journalist does a piece and all of a sudden, a new project hits the media. But there isn't this kind of commitment to transparency and public accountability when it comes to tech development generally, I would say, but especially at the border.
And in normal society, a lawyer is held, to a certain level of prestige, and you get a certain amount of respect from your community. But did you find in going to these places that it was the opposite, that you are now the enemy seen by some of these? I would think lawyers would stand right out as, no, stay away, get out of here. Anyone with a camera, anyone with a law degree, anyone with the education that would spread the information.
Definitely. I mean, that was the case in a variety of the different areas that I've worked in, where it was almost a liability to say, oh, I'm a lawyer, but then on the other hand, I think also when you are a lawyer, you of course are aware of your own rights, and also your ability to kind of do your job depends on speaking truth to power, so to speak, and asking the hard questions. And so definitely, though, I noticed a trend where, more as more borders become militarized and difficult to access, it's no accident that states don't want people who are human rights monitors or who are journalists kind of poking their nose in there when, a lot of, again, that kind of experimentation is happening there without public scrutiny. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I think it definitely helps to be a lawyer doing this work, but sometimes it can make you be seen as somebody that they definitely don't want there.
Yeah. I had a friend who did some work in Guantanamo Bay, and he said every time he flew down there, it was like, treated nice. He's a gentleman. He's in a suit. And then as soon as he stepped off the plane and got there, it was like he felt like he was one of the inmates. Like the guards, didn't want anything to do with him, like would put up, roadblocks every step of the way, make him wait hours to talk to his clients, those sort of things. And I just would imagine you would encounter those same sort of, I guess, arbitrary blockades, when you get to these places.
Yeah, definitely. And the other issue that I have had, and it's not just unique to me, but I think to a lot of people in this space, is trying to also engage with the private sector that's involved in this. And I know that's not something we've talked about yet, but they're a major player in the development and deployment of this technology, because oftentimes states just can't do it themselves in-house, right? Like they need to contract out these projects to private companies. And when you go to, some of the conferences where this technology is being sold and kind of proposed as a solution to these complicated, quote unquote, societal problems, right? Like, oh, you're worried about refugees? Here's a RoboDog. If you buy this will solve your problem. That's the kind of thinking. As soon as they see that you're a lawyer or an academic, they don't want to talk to you, right? Because they know that you're there trying to get at the parameters of what they're doing and why and all of this. And so that was definitely something that I was, I wouldn't say I was surprised by, but it was like yet another element, because when you're trying to understand this ecosystem and this multi-billion-dollar border industrial complex that has grown up around the development of migration management tech, trying to understand how the private sector fits into it and like following the money is very difficult, because a lot of it isn't public either, and they don't want to talk about it.
I'm so glad you introduced me to the term or to the phrase border industrial complex, because I could just like mentally like find and replace, like do like control F, like find and replace like military industrial complex, and like all of my like skepticism and criticisms of, like foreign engagements or whatever it is, I could just like take those things, like cut and paste. And now I have a useful framework for thinking about when I hear something in the news or when I'm just thinking about like the border. That's such a useful phrase for me to like conceive of, everything, because I think today in particular, I mean, today, and this is kind of like broadly cross political spectrum, like skepticism of, um, foreign engagements. I mean, like all of a sudden there's a whole cohort of folks that are, isolationists or whatever you want to call it. And so the term, military industrial complex is so ubiquitous and it's thrown around and people understand inherently now, like what that means. And so to just go, oh, like the border industrial complex, for me, it's just like, oh, like that just clarifies so much. I don't have to do any more thinking from like the ground up. Like it's the same principles all apply. And I remember reading in the book, I was like, oh, that's just, I understand so much about this now just from flipping that switch in my own brain. It's very helpful.
Oh, thanks. And, I can't take credit for that. I mean, I would also urge listeners to check out the work of Todd Miller, who's an amazing journalist in Arizona. He's been working on the border industrial complex stuff for years. And I think it's a really helpful framing, yeah, because again, it centers the kind of capitalism that is inherent in the way that we develop technology and the fact that there's big money being made at the border, just like in military engagements, but also at the border.
Well, and also in that the investments in it aren't necessarily like optimized for, solving the problem so much as they are optimized for prolonging the spending of money. So, and
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And I think that's something that we don't really talk about. Like I actually think we've kind of lost the plot on a lot of the conversations around migration because, and I understand that it is a very complex, very fraught topic that is very divisive. But, for me as someone who's been working in migration on and off in different ways since, 2008, all the people that I've met, and it's been hundreds, right? Nobody wants to be a refugee, right? Like the thing is, people are forced to move, and they're also exercising their internationally protected right to do so, the right that belongs to me, to you, to listeners, to everyone on the planet, right? But they are moving because of war, because of destabilization, oftentimes because of Western action, right? In
Sure.
places around the world, environment, all sorts of reasons. So I think we actually need to flip the conversation and say, well, how do we address the root causes of forced migration? Like, how can we support communities locally and spend even a fraction of this money that is being used in the border industrial complex? Like, I think it's projected to be around $70 billion in the next couple of years. I mean, even a fraction of that would go so far to try and, again, deal with the root causes of displacement. That's where we need to start. Because, again, I think we've painted people on the move as threats, as criminals, as people who are taking advantage of the system somehow, versus looking at them as human beings and something, migration can happen to all of us, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you brought up the sort of international rights of movement and these things. And this is a kind of a lawyer podcast whose audience is probably largely comprised of a lot of other lawyers, things like that. Two concepts that I thought may be worth mentioning: non-refoulement, and then there is the 1951 Refugee Convention. To me, seem to be like two of the underpinnings of this idea of internationally protected rights of movement. And we're not, I'll speak for Vanessa here. We're not the type of attorneys that have to deal with this. So could you tell us what those things are and why they're important and to who those rights or obligations apply to?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take off my anthropology hat and put my lawyer hat on. I'm a reluctant lawyer, but still a lawyer. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I think this is one of the foundational underpinnings of these conversations that we sometimes forget about because, it's it's a right that is internationally protected and available to all of us. The right to leave our country of origin if we face persecution, if we face danger, and to seek support somewhere else. And so the 1951 Refugee Convention, which was drafted after World War II, is the foundational international legal document that stipulates that, there's a legal test that you have to meet. There are 5 categories on which you can claim refugee protection, but you have the ability to leave your country and seek protection elsewhere. The non-refoulement principle is a norm under international law that states that you are not allowed to remove someone from your country if they will face persecution in the place that you're removing them to, right? And this is something that, again, I think is under threat a lot these days when we talk about practices like pushbacks or the ways that different states, for example, are not even allowing people to come on their territory and claim asylum. It's almost like some states want to have it both ways, right? Like they want to say, oh, we are human rights respecting. We have signed and ratified all these nice, pretty international documents and also imported them into our own domestic legislation, right? Like in the United States, Canada, Europe. But then actually when push comes to shove, it's like, well, we're going to derogate from them and actually create this other regime where people are not even allowed to actually enter the territory when those rights kind of kick in. But again, there is a really foundational, strong framework on which to pin responsibility to when we're talking about asylum law. This is, an established also line of jurisprudence that has been with us for decades now. But we are seeing this weakening of these norms, unfortunately, these days. And technology plays a part into that because it also kind of disaggregates the border, right, from its physical location. Not to get too theoretical, but if you can use technology, right, to push your border either vertically into the skies through drones and different types of surveillance, or horizontally through data collection, different types of surveillance as well, then people are not even making it to your border in the first place, right? You're kind of creating this zone of bordering that is much wider and much more difficult to cross, and that's no accident. There is definitely a weakening of this regime that we've seen across all these different jurisdictions around the world.
Well, I think it's because now the promises and obligations that many of these countries, purport to support are actually being tested, maybe for at least in large numbers for the first time in a long time. And it's kind of do you actually support these ideas or not? And it's like push comes to shove. Actually, we don't. We actually don't support them. And in fact, one way we can avoid having to abide by these treaties or laws, whether they're international or domestic, and avoid incurring obligations to refugees or migrants is to, for example, build a huge wall so that you can't come here and claim them. That seems to be what was happening the example that jumped out to me was your time on the border of Greece and Turkey. And this was in I can't remember what region it was, but it was the part of Greece that's like close to Istanbul and like Bulgaria. I don't remember the name of it. But where it's like, otherwise like a pretty like agricultural and kind of like, I don't want to say backwater, but certainly not a node of power in Greece, but all of a sudden is getting, billions of dollars in fundings to build like AI sensor towers and like all of this security technology just because it's on the border and to keep refugees from coming into Greece, to keep them from coming in because the moment they set foot inside, they, have a claim to certain rights and privileges. Whether the country wants to uphold them or not, but at least they have that claim once inside. So it seems like the investment is coming to a kind of a poor backwater part of the country that would love to have government investment in any other sector, I'm sure, but what they get is like sensor towers and robot dogs to keep out even poorer and more needy people from coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. But what's also interesting, right, is like so many states use precisely this logic of deterrence, of saying, well, we need more technology, we need a wall, we need robodogs, we need AI sensors. Let's put them in these spaces that are sometimes, economically disenfranchised, right? And we're going to prevent people from coming. But the thing is, it doesn't work, right? People will just take more dangerous routes to avoid detection and to avoid surveillance. This is something that's been documented at the US-Mexico border, where since the introduction of this so-called smart wall and smart border regime, deaths have nearly tripled. And because people still continue coming, right? They're just taking more circuitous, more dangerous routes through the desert, which leads to an increased loss of life. But walls don't work, right? When people are desperate, and also again when they're exercising their internationally protected right to asylum, they're going to find a way. And if I can just share an anecdote very recently, so when my book came out in May, I went to Arizona to share it with some of the search and rescue groups there. And we had a really nice time in Tucson and some of the neighboring communities. But, because of my ethnographer hat, I was like, what's happening at the border? Let's drive down and see some of this new smart wall stuff that's been introduced and like what's changed since my last visit there about a year ago. And so I went down there with journalist Todd Miller, and we were just kind of, standing there shooting the shit, like talking about what's happening. And we were in Nogales, which is a border town that's bisected by the wall. So you have Nogales in Mexico and Nogales in Arizona. And we were right by the wall, which you can go to, you can see it. There's sometimes customs and border protection trucks kind of rumbling by. There's a fixed integrated kind of surveillance tower there. There's now a new smart track, which I guess is going to have all sorts of sensors there, whatever. And it was a really, really hot day. And we're kind of standing there sweating, really dusty, and looking over into this area where the tower stands. And all of a sudden, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. And we literally saw a young man scale the wall, jump down in front of us into the sand, right underneath the surveillance tower, shake himself off, and run off into the neighborhood, right? And to me, that is such an example of just like how these surveillance techniques don't work, right? Yeah. Because people will find a way. So instead of spending and wasting all this money on surveillance tech, like let's think about what else we could be doing to improve the asylum system, to give people access to lawyers, to support them psychosocially, again, to address root causes of migration in the first place, rather than investing in surveillance technology that doesn't even work. Mm-hmm. Then it also makes me think, though, like, is it about the performance of surveillance, right?
Right.
Rather than it actually working, it's about the state making us feel like they have it under control and they're like introducing all this tech and then it's not actually working in the first place, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe it's just this theater of the border that we have to pay attention to.
I mean, it's manifestly not working. And if your metric is, keeping, let's say, people out, well, anytime you turn on the news or look on TV, you see people screaming about how many people are coming in. So it's like objectively and manifestly not working. If that's the case, no matter how much money is being spent, it's still happening. So to your point, perhaps this technology and everything else is really not a worthwhile investment, even if that is your goal, which I'm not saying it should be. But if it is, it's not working. They're still coming, as you mentioned.
Obviously, not surprisingly, AI has been all over the news for a bunch of different reasons, but it seems like finally the European Union is paying attention to the dangers of AI. I think on a global level, we are. People are, scientists are coming forward and saying, here's what can happen. We need to pay attention to this and how it's being used. But specific to your line of work, you've gone to some of these conferences. I know some of the big ones before the UN. What are you seeing with regards to where we're at in trying to regulate artificial intelligence when it comes to the borders?
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment when it comes to the kind of governance and regulatory conversations that are being had. And unfortunately, it's been a bit disappointing in the last little while. I want to point specifically to the European Union's AI Act, which was, something that was in the works, this big omnibus piece of lawmaking to try and regulate AI. And it took many years to come to its final form, right, which happened earlier this year. And, there was a group of us, in full disclosure, some lawyers, some civil society, some academics, trying to get members of the European Parliament to think about the human rights impacts of border technologies and call for some amendments to the act. For example, saying you need to ban predictive analytics that are used for border interdictions or pushbacks, right? Like we were talking about with the non-refoulement principle, something that's actually blatantly illegal under international law, or using individualized risk assessments using AI at the border, things like that. But again, given the fact that migration is a very politically charged issue, a lot of these amendments just didn't pass. And so now, when you actually look at the text of the AI Act, at first blush, it might seem like, well, what's the problem? There's a risk matrix, that is used to assess different technologies, and border tech largely falls under high risk technologies. So isn't that a good thing? Well, except, of course, for the legal listeners in the room, it won't be a surprise when I say that there are so many ways that, again, we can derogate from this kind of risk principle that is there. Because as soon as something becomes designated, a technology for the use of national security issues, then the framework doesn't hold anymore, right? And so it just allows for technology to be kind of pushed into the border space and in migration under the guise of national security without the act and its kind of frameworks applying. And not only is this, a European issue, right? But the thing is, the AI Act could have been a real push to call for governance and regulation of border technologies globally, right? Because it is the first regional attempt to govern AI, and it sets the precedent. And so if the AI Act is weak, there's no incentive for the United States, for Canada, for Australia to regulate. This happened, with the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR in the EU, right, which set a really strong precedent. Not that it's perfect either, but it forced other jurisdictions to think about data protection in their own, kind of behind closed doors in their own jurisdictions. And unfortunately, the AI Act just will not have that same power. And even though there are some conversations happening, in Canada and even in the US, the recently kind of released executive order on AI that the Biden administration came out with was silent on border tech. It didn't mention borders once, right? So again, it's not a priority. And I think it's actually deliberate, right? Because leaving borders as a testing ground is useful for the state because it allows the state to experiment in ways that just won't be able to do, when it comes to other spaces of public life, for example.
Would be broadly unconstitutional and violating a lot of rules and laws. Yes.
Well, and like you said, not just states, but these private companies, like you mentioned in the Walls Have Eyes, I forget what company it was, but setting up in Israel, where, they've made billions of dollars testing different technologies out on the Palestinian population, and then sell that technology to, other states to use however they need to. Some of the, because I know we say AI and it just sounds, what is AI? But I just wanted to give a couple of examples that you brought up, which I think we as lay people can understand the issues with. One thing you addressed was the voice printing of cross-matching somebody's voice with a database of accents. And you raised the issue of, dialects can change under different circumstances. And that one just hit me because I just came back from my native state of New Hampshire. And when we were there, my husband was like, oh, you're suddenly dropping your R's and you're speaking in a totally different way when you're with your family. But it's true. The circumstances, the subject matter, have you seen some of that play out, I guess?
Absolutely. And, thanks for bringing that up, because that is such a visceral example that I think a lot of people can identify with. For me too, English is not my first language. And I find that, when I'm tired, for example, my accent comes out more, or if I'm in different spaces, we code switch, right, as well. And so our accents change based on who we speak with, and it's such a short-sighted way of trying to understand just human beings, right? I mean, this voice printing program was used by Germany in its asylum system, for example, and it would have somebody speak, into this program, and then it would be assessed, and the program would say, oh, well, this person is likely from Daraa province in the south of Syria because of their accent and not Aleppo, the big city. but they said that they're from Aleppo and therefore they must be lying, and therefore we need to assess their credibility in a different way, right? But I think this is the problem with AI. It's like human beings struggle with the complexities of just human behavior, right? It also makes me think of these other projects that I find really disturbing, these pilot projects that basically created a so-called AI lie detector to be tested out at the border. And this AI lie detector would use facial recognition or micro expression analysis to be able to make a determination about whether or not someone's telling the truth when they're interacting with this avatar. But again, I used to practice refugee law, and right, if there are listeners in who are listening in, this might be familiar. Like I've had people that I was representing maybe act in a way that a judge was having trouble understanding, or they weren't making eye contact with a judge of the opposite gender because of religion, because of their experiences, maybe because they were nervous, right? Or what about the impact of trauma on memory and the fact that we don't tell stories in a linear way anyway, let alone some of the most difficult things that we have to talk about? Like human decision makers struggle with this and make very problematic assumptions about credibility, plausibility, truthfulness. That is the starting point of any refugee assessment, right? And so if human decision makers do that, what will a partially or a fully automated system be able to do? One that's predicated on a very biased and discriminatory world that we live in already. Like to me, it's just so troubling that we are seeing these AI technologies, whether it's voice printing or AI lie detection or anything in between, kind of forced into the migration space without even did they talk to a refugee lawyer or a refugee themselves, right? Before piloting some of this? Like to me, this is really disturbing.
And we can't even, post hoc go and look at what those inputs are because in a lot of those cases, as you talk about in the book, it's classified. It's secretive. And there's no way for anyone to look into it and decide whether this stuff even works. And I mean, all of these are operating under the assumption that when applied correctly, this algorithmic decision-making process will be accurate. And I think even that is extremely presumptuous. I tend to be, and sometimes the show tends to be a little bearish on AI and tech and things of that matter. And this is the assumption that this stuff could even work is, I think, a one that requires a lot of faith. And I don't know that it's, I mean, even setting aside the biases that are going to be inherent, coming from someone who's, or the biases that are going to be inherent in setting up these algorithms and these processes and policies. I just don't know that they're effective enough for anyone to rely on them and on these, important decisions that are being made on the border and in our immigration process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that has to be the starting point, right? Like, does this stuff even work? Some of it is snake oil, right? Like the AI lie detector was debunked as something that's just not even working. But that's the disturbing part, that it's just kind of thought of, well, this is a good idea to try out at the border. Again, because it's opaque space, it's a discretionary space. There's not a lot of accountability or oversight or anything like that. And so I think it's actually about these bigger questions. Like, what kind of world are we building? And are we okay with these technologies in the first place when we know that a lot of them don't even work? Not to then mention, it's also about the kind of direction of travel, so to speak, right? Because they're always aimed at marginalized communities or people who don't have access to the same level of rights or even legal representation sometimes. Like, we could be using AI to audit immigration decision making, right? Or to root out racist border guards. Like, that's a choice, right? But instead, the AI is positioned towards people on the move or refugees or people who, oftentimes, again, sometimes don't even know that AI and automated decision making is being applied in their case. This happened in Canada, where lawyers, after the fact, when they got their hands on some evidence of refused, for example, visa applications, saw the decisions and they were like, hold on, a human did not write this, right? But if, again, English is your second or third or fourth language and you don't have a lawyer and you have no idea, you're not going to assume that AI is making the decisions, right?
Right.
It's just, the whole thing is really troubling because so much of it happens behind closed doors and even lawyers sometimes don't know what's going on.
That's such a good point. If it was so reliable and so trustworthy, then you would see it applied to audit judicial decisions, and people that actually have an opportunity to push back against it. You would see it applied against them, but you don't. you only see it applied against folks that have, no ability to challenge it.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just even in the immigration space, right? But we're seeing similar incursions in criminal justice with predictive policing, right? And sentencing algorithms, welfare algorithms, child protection algorithms. It's not an accident, right, that it happens kind of in marginalized spaces rather than in spaces of power.
Right. You're not seeing it against you're not auditing like prosecutors or judges or things of that sort. Yeah. Just the folks that can't defend themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And on one hand, maybe we should be calling for that, right? But then it also then normalizes tech in those spaces too, which maybe isn't a good thing either.
But those are the people that would probably, have platforms to speak out against it. I could just imagine the boardroom of the people that are collecting the data on this. And I'm sure the assumption is, 60% of these people were found lying. That means it's working, that's how they're viewing the data. Like the goal is to keep people out. So if it's doing that, then it's working. It's scary.
Well, that's exactly it. I think, what you just said is really key. It's about paying attention to the priorities and whose priorities actually set the stage, right? And if the priority is exclusion and keeping people out and finding a technical solution to a complex societal problem, then there you go. This is what kind of drives, again, this border industrial complex. Like, it's not an accident that we're seeing robodogs and AI lie detectors and drones, because they're seen as a solution to a problem that has been created by powerful actors who say that people on the move are the problem.
Right. Well, and I do love the way that you wrap up your book, Petra, by I just want to quote one part from one of your last chapters. People on the move often have to prove that they are somehow worthy of our respect. That line stuck with me. And then you end with this story from Zaid Ibrahim. And he says, what was our crime? That we fled from Syria? It's like we kind of put refugees in this other category, but this changed my whole mindset of, no, that could be me. And, what is my crime? Fleeing somewhere where my family can get shot in the streets, or we don't have food, or we don't have access to medicine. We need to, and I think your book does a good job of this, of humanizing. These are people, and what's being used against them is not right, and it wouldn't be allowed in our day-to-day lives. So why are we allowing it in these spaces?
Yeah, and that was really my whole goal with this book, and indeed with the whole corpus of my work, is to humanize the situation and to kind of try and, at least in some small way, fight against this kind of dehumanization narrative that presents people on the move as threats, as just someone out there that people cannot relate to. But what you just said, I think, is really key. I mean, this can happen to anybody, and it has, in fact, historically, right? Conflict happen, and people have to flee. And again, people don't choose to be refugees, and we would do anything to save our children or our families, right? If you know that you have to make some desperate decisions and either cross a desert or put your children in a boat. I mean, that is the last resort, right? But people do it because they know they must. But I think we can't lose sight of that there are real human stories at the center of all of this. And I think that really is hopefully the takeaway of the book.
You describe yourself as a reluctant lawyer, but one way that we can tell you're an authentic lawyer is the PDF of the book that you sent is .final, which is like the classic, like 10 drafts later, this is .final, like all caps.
I just want to thank you both for like really engaging with the book. Not everybody does that. And I'm really grateful for that.
Well, thanks for writing a good book. Not everyone does that.
It was pretty easy.
Some people write really boring books, and now we're stuck.
Well, I will say, I really, like, from the get-go, I knew this was not going to be an academic book. Like, yes, okay, it's undergirded by years of research and analysis or whatever, but like, I wanted it to be something that everybody could pick up. And I have to say that the biggest, I think, most proudest moment of my career is when we found out that it was available at Target. Like, to me, I'm like, this is great.
Well,
so for our listeners, where can they find you on socials? Where can they find your book? Give some information, because I hope that our listeners will pick it up.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you're interested in finding out more about the work or about the book in general, I have a website, just my name, petramolnar.com. I'm also on Twitter. And the book is available anywhere that books are sold, whether that is a small local bookshop, hopefully, or Amazon or Target. It's available.
Thank you so much. I mean, first of all, thank you for writing the book. Irrespective of whether you're going to be on the show or not, it's a tremendous work that you spent a ton of time and effort and put yourself in harm's way quite a few times. It's an excellent read. Highly recommend to anyone who's looking to learn about this topic, but also to be entertained. It's got a really fantastic narrative as well. Thank you for spending the last hour and 10 minutes talking with us about this. And for those of you that want to learn more, check out Petra's website, Twitter account, buy the book.
Yeah, we can't wait to see when you're quoted, at the international level for the reason why they start looking at these policies more seriously and changing things. So we appreciate your work and all your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, well, that's our show. We want to say a huge thank you again to Petra Molnar for joining us. Such an interesting topic, and certainly one that I think everyone needs to pay attention to, given that these technologies are now turning mainstream. So hope you pick up the book and enjoy it as much as we did. Again, we will be back every 2 weeks. You can listen to Litigation Nation wherever you get your podcast. And we will provide links to access the Walls Have Eyes as well. We'll see you next time. Thanks.